It's been nearly a year since Disney's live-action remake of The Little Mermaid came out, yet the controversy it sparked has yet to be forgotten. There has been a lot of heated debate centered around this movie, some of which has been rational, and some, well, not so much. In this video, I want to go over some arguments both in defense of and critical of this movie that I don't believe hold water, no pun intended. Please keep in mind that while I believe my opinions to be rational, they are ultimately my opinions. If you disagree with them, that's fine. Just please keep it civil in the comment section. Thanks. Let's start with bad arguments for The Little Mermaid remake. Argument number 1. You just don't like this movie because it doesn't star a white redhead. First off, this claim is not only erroneous, it's an insult to pretty much every non-white lead Disney, and for that matter Hollywood, has ever had. I don't see anyone hating on Tiana for not being white, or Jasmine, or Pocahontas, or Esmeralda, or Lilo, or Kita, or Moana, or Mirabelle. People do not have a problem with non-white characters. Of course, this argument centers around the fact that the original Ariel was, in fact, a white redhead, while Halle Bailey's Ariel is black. I've already talked about this in other videos, which I will link in the description. Suffice it to say that Disney tried to eat their cake and have it too, and ended up face-planting in it. The issue here stems from the fact that not only is this movie a remake, it sets itself up as if it were a completely faithful remake of the 1989 film, rather than a more innovative retelling. Lifting entire scenes, songs, and chunks of dialogue wholesale from the original would indicate that this is meant to be just that, the cartoon brought to life. But if that's what Disney was going for, they utterly ruined the effect by completely changing not only Ariel's appearance, but also that of her sisters, not to mention the uncanny CGI versions of Flounder and Sebastian and the absurdly dark ocean. This is clearly not the cartoon brought to life at all. The two films look nothing alike. If, on the other hand, Disney had been going for a more creative retelling of the story, then having characters as different races would be absolutely no problem. But Disney, either through laziness or cowardice, kept the film too close to the original for it to pass as a creative retelling. What's more, they spent far too much time patting themselves on the back for promoting diversity instead of creativity. This is what I call a bad faith race swap. It's quite clear that Disney did this to score ESG brownie points. I'll come back to this point later in the video. But before anyone says that Halle was hired solely for her talent, first off, if you think anyone in Hollywood is ever hired solely on talent, you have proven yourself to be an innocent nincompoop. Second, ponder this question. Disney claimed that they considered multiple candidates of every race for the part of Ariel. But had they cast a white or Asian actress as Ariel, would they still have had it take place in the Caribbean? Just think about that for a minute. But even if it were true and she had been hired entirely for her talent, Disney stuck themselves in the foot by both touting themselves for pushing diversity, as well as relying far too heavily on nostalgia to sell this thing. If Disney were not so creatively bankrupt, they wouldn't need to rely on such tactics to sell their films. It's a real shame, too, because it portrays Halle as a diversity hire, which sadly eclipses her real talent for a lot of people. But you know what? You can discount everything I've said so far, throw it all out the window, because at the end of the day, the main problem with this argument is that it's irrelevant. There are plenty of other reasons to criticize this movie that have absolutely nothing to do with anyone's race, Halle's or otherwise. If you like the movie, that's fine. There are movies I like that I know most people don't, and that's okay. But I, and apparently most people who watched it, found it to be subpar for a variety of reasons. Uncanny CGI, poor lighting, dull costuming, atrocious musical choices, bad directing which leads to bad acting, and above all, nonsensical storytelling. So accusing me or anyone else of racism just because we didn't like this movie is completely disingenuous. Argument number 2. It's just a kid's movie. You shouldn't care so much. Please excuse me for a moment. Okay. Breathe. I'm sorry, but I hate this argument with every fiber of my being. In fact, I hate it more than the race argument. First off, this statement is a straight-up lie. This movie wasn't made for children. It was made for parents and Disney adults who want a nostalgia fix. That's why it relies so heavily on nostalgia from the original movie, because it's enough to get many people to buy the ticket. And seriously, how many kids would want a plushie of this version of Flounder or Sebastian? I mean, come on. But even if it is a kids' movie, the idea that we therefore shouldn't care about it is utter lunacy. After all, don't kids deserve good movies and good stories? And as C.S. Lewis put it, no book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not equally, and often far more, worth reading at the age of 50, except of course books of information. The only imaginative works we ought to grow out of are those which it would have been better not to read at all. Of course, this applies to movies and shows as well as books, because people can enjoy any story at any age, as long as that story is worth telling. Good stories last a lifetime, and they matter forever. Argument number 3. Halle and her team worked hard on this. Stop hating on it. You should just be grateful to Disney for making it for us. Ah, yes, the classic. Someone worked hard on this, so you shouldn't say anything negative about it. Now, I have no doubt that a lot of hard work went into this at the middle and lower levels of production. Personally, I think that bad CGI is likely the result of Disney not giving their VFX people enough time, or indeed pay, to get the job done, not because these people didn't care or are incompetent. But unfortunately, the higher-ups clearly don't care about good storytelling, and thus the movie suffered as a result. Like it or not, I did not think this movie was good. It's not the worst movie I've ever seen, but it's not good. But that doesn't mean that I think the cast and crew are necessarily the ones at fault. I honestly think Halle is a much more talented actress than this movie has led many people to believe, and the apparent faults in the actress' performances are largely due to bad directing, a problem that can mutilate the work of even the most skilled actors.
It vexes me. I'm terribly vexed.
And as for the idea that I should just be grateful and not negative, grateful for what? For a subpar movie that cost hundreds of millions of dollars that could have been better spent elsewhere? Look, this isn't kindergarten. This is the professional world. If you mess up, you have to learn to correct your mistakes, one way or another. Before I move on to the next section, I have one final point to make here. All 3 of these arguments have one thing in common. They are all deflections. They are not reasons why the movie is good. They are reasons why it should be excused for being bad. If anyone has a reason why they actually liked it, I'm ready to hear. There were even a few things I liked myself, like this scene.
Nearly all of these things come from my voyages. I know it must seem silly collecting all this stuff, but just look at this fossilized sea stone. Can you believe that such amazing things exist down there? No, wait! How did you know that was in there?
Why couldn't the whole movie have been as good as that? There was potential for a good movie here, but Disney squandered it. On to bad arguments against the Little Mermaid remake. Now, if you've been watching this video up till now, you've probably gathered that I do not think very highly of this film. That said, there have been some criticisms leveled against it that I don't believe are valid. I may agree that this isn't a good film, but that doesn't mean everything negative said about it is true. And it's only fair to look at both sides of the sound, so let's get into it. Argument number 1. Scientifically, mermaids cannot be black because their skin couldn't possibly absorb enough sunlight through the water. I'm sorry, what? This argument is so ridiculous. First, why are we applying scientific principles to a Disney fairy tale of all things? This is not a large-scale story with massive amounts of world building, something like The Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. It's a one-shot fairy tale. We don't need to be overthinking it that hard. What's more, if we buy this argument, we would have to discount every other dark-skinned mermaid character ever made, such as Gabriella from the Little Mermaid television series, or indeed Mami Wata from African mythology. A blanket statement like this really cramps on creativity and, dare I say it, diversity of storytelling. Let's face it, if mermaids were real, they would probably look more like the merpeople from Harry Potter than Disney's Ariel. It's a fantasy. Just roll with it. That said, before I move on to the next section, I do need to address one thing. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having a mermaid character be black, or indeed any race. However, having Ariel and all of her sisters be different races feels a little more counterintuitive. I get that they're supposed to represent the seven seas, but it still looks very odd. Plus, having Ariel pull ship steering skills out of her tail at the end is just absurd. The fact that this is a fantasy movie does not excuse every inconsistency in it. As one YouTuber put it, when you mess with the fundamentals of reality too much, things stop feeling plausible, and that's not good. Argument number 2. The Little Mermaid is a Danish fairy tale. Disney shouldn't be culturally appropriating a piece of European heritage. Remember what I said earlier about this being a bad faith race swap? Well, that statement would imply that there's such a thing as good faith race swapping, right? Why, yes, there is. Let's have a look. Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, published in 1813, is a Regency romance that takes place in Austen's home country, England. There have been multiple adaptations made of this story, including a very faithful one by the BBC in 1995. Due to its setting in 19th century England and its focus on the upper classes of that time period, the casting for the BBC's version of the story is all white. However, many of these adaptations change the setting of the story. For instance, the 2004 film Bride and Prejudice tells the same story in essentials, but takes place in modern-day India. Thus, it makes sense that the majority of the cast would be Indian actors and actresses. And considering how many liberties the film takes with the source material, it's perfectly reasonable to call this a creative retelling, and so is justified in the changes it makes. Another adaptation, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which premiered in 2012, changes the setting to modern-day America, with Lizzie as a college senior making a vlog about her daily life for a school project. Due to the setting change, many of the characters are different races, which would be inaccurate for a faithful adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, but is entirely appropriate for this series. For a different kind of example, see The Princess and the Barrio Boy from 2000. Again, this story takes place in modern-day America and follows the story of a Latina teenager named Serena, whose name means mermaid in Spanish. Although not a retelling of The Little Mermaid per se, the movie definitely takes story cues from the fairy tale. In particular, Serena makes a deal with her father's horrible fiancé, Minerva, that she can do whatever she wants as long as she makes no protests about her father's marrying Minerva. Essentially, she's trading freedom for silence. Sound familiar? Notice that all these film adaptations I've mentioned take place in modern-day settings. This makes it both more believable and indeed wise to have characters of different ethnicities. After all, the world is, thankfully, more diverse and colorful than it was 200 years ago. The point is to cast your characters in a way that is appropriate for the setting. Now, I hear someone saying, but the Little Mermaid remake was set in the Caribbean, so Halle as Ariel is completely appropriate, right? Well, aside from my earlier question about this point, this comment would in fact be correct. Having a black actress for Ariel in a Caribbean setting does make sense. Problem is, Aside from maybe the village market scene, I completely forgot that this movie was supposed to take place in the Caribbean at all. I don't know, I'm not a Caribbean culture expert, so maybe there's something I missed here, but it really doesn't seem like the setting change is justified here. And frankly, it would have looked more convincing if they had just gone all in and had an all-black cast. Then you wouldn't need the awkward Eric is adopted thing. I get where this argument came from. It came from bad timing, essentially. The teaser trailer for The Little Mermaid came out in the wake of the backlash against the Rings of Power by Amazon, where the cast and showrunners kept making the show diverse and making it reflect the modern world, which is pretty much exactly the opposite of Tolkien's intentions, and basically said anyone who didn't accept it was racist. So when people who were upset over this saw a black woman portraying Ariel, they naturally guessed that it was also in the name of diversity, just like Rings of Power. And Disney themselves did absolutely nothing to dispel this idea. Argument number 3. The climax should not have been changed because Eric defeating Ursula is what convinces Triton that humans are good. I hate to burst people's bubble on this one, but this is a fan theory, not a fact from the animated film. It's a similar situation to Padme's death in Star Wars Episode 3. There's a very plausible theory concerning this scene that Palpatine actually kills Padme by draining her life force into Anakin to make him Darth Vader. And that is why a seemingly healthy woman is suddenly dying for no known reason that the medical droids can identify. This theory dovetails nicely both with the plot of the story and with Palpatine's character. It has every merit except that of actually being supported by anything in the film. It's a fan theory, a very plausible fan theory that actually makes more sense than the information presented in the film, but still, it's not actually canon. Back to The Little Mermaid. The same principle holds true here. The idea that Eric's actions convince Triton that humans can be good is a very convincing theory. It makes logical sense, and Triton seems intelligent enough to come to that conclusion, not to mention the fact that he has Sebastian there to back it up. But at no point does Triton ever actually state this out loud. His only comment about Eric after the fact is,
"She really does love him, doesn't she, Sebastian?"
Clearly, his decision to allow Ariel to join the human world is based on his observation of her feelings. Granted, he might not have made this decision if Eric weren't obviously a good person, but again, that's never actually stated. In fact, the remake actually supports this theory better by having Ariel explicitly state to Triton that Eric helped her.
"I didn't fight alone, Father. Eric was with me."
Of course, this statement would be rather more impactful if Eric had actually done something. Well, he does still injure Ursula when she attacks Ariel, so I guess that's something. Now, I still had major problems with the climax of this film, not because Ariel defeats Ursula instead of Eric, but because the way she does it makes no sense. She's a mermaid and has never even been on a ship before, let alone steered one. If they had had a scene of Eric showing her how to work the rudder, it would have at least felt a little more plausible. Oh well. So that's it. Thanks for watching. God bless.